Hello, everyone. Welcome this evening to The Conduit. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Harry Cortapena. I'm Director of IPPR, and we are really, really pleased to be hosting this event in partnership with The Conduit. The politics and the context that we find ourselves in is both very new, very emerging and challenging, but also there's some exciting opportunities. So it's a great moment to be coming together. We're here to discuss the state of the UK today, what that's doing to our politics, and what we do about it, and in particular, what we think the new government should be doing about it. So for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, children born in Britain are not sure to be better off than their parents. It's far from certain that a doctor or a police officer will turn up if you need them in the UK at the moment. The public services are in a really difficult position. And Britain is really ready for renewal. And if we doubted that, we've just had a government elected on a manifesto with the single word change. And yet, although that government was given a commanding majority, it's a majority on a knife edge. So with electoral volatility at new highs and a very, very slim, low turnout, although Labour have a commanding majority, it's going to be a challenge to hold on to that majority and to use it to transform the country. And in that context, we see a rise in people who are voting for populist alternatives, but also people who aren't turning out to vote at all, who are angry or disengaged. And so today's event is to talk about a concept that is started to emerge, and Josh Simons, who I'll introduce in a minute, I think wrote the first piece on this, insurgent government, as a proposal for how we address that, and in particular, an idea about how a government can be, from the centre ground of politics, can be genuinely radical and deliver genuine change that is felt by people across the country. But how to do that, and how to also get credit for that in a media landscape that's really fragmented, is a big challenge. So that's what we're here to talk about. I am going to sit down now. I'm going to introduce our panel in just a second. But before I do that, I want to ask Dr. Parth Patel to come on the stage. Parth is a principal research fellow with IPPR and is leading a new programme of work which this sits as part of. So I'm going to hand over to Parth.
Thanks, Harry. Hi, everyone. I'll be brief so you can get into the main event. And just to building off what Harry has said as to why IPPR are starting to convene these discussions, connecting the dots across ideas, politics, and policy. Because underlying the things that Harry said, the problems in Britain today is an out-of-date politics. The policies and institutions designed to build economic growth and social justice in this country more than half a century ago aren't really fit for today. And the Prime Minister has said the central defining purpose of his government is to build a decade of national renewal. Ushering that in is easier said than done. Many governments have attempted broad and enduring change. Most of them have failed. The observed experience of government is that strategic thinking of the future is relegated to something ornamental by the enormous challenges of the day-to-day, the enormous challenges of governing. Now, the handful of governments that have gone the distance, governments like Thatcher's, governments like Blair's, they managed to keep an alertness to developments around the world, an eye on how people were changing, and an openness to ideas and to new policies. They were able to do that by working effectively with people beyond the realms of the party, thinkers, practitioners, and others. That's why the IPPR is launching this Decade of National Renewal programme. It has a single objective: to help this government build one. And that's because the stakes feel quite high to us. The stakes are high not just for this government, for democracy. The trust, and this is overdone sometimes, but confidence in politics is kind of frighteningly low, and the populists who prey on those suspicions are circling in growing numbers. And for a place like IPPR, we want the future to be progressive, not populist, right? Whether this government succeeds or whether it fails, it will shape the future of Britain. And so we'll be convening discussions like these, trying to inject new thinking into old problems and old wisdom into new ones to try and help this government build that decade of national renewal. I'll be around in the back, get in touch with me. We have many more events lined up. We've got a pipeline of reports to come, the first of which will come out next Friday with Phil Tinline, who is somewhere here in the audience, a study of post-war governments. So keep an eye out and come grab me if you're interested in the kinds of things we're talking about. Cheers.
Thank you, Parth. So I'm now going to turn to what I think is an amazing panel to be having this conversation. So we have Josh Simons, MP, Member of Parliament for Makerfield and former Director of Labour Together, also former intern at IPPR back in the day. We have the Right Honourable Michael Gove, former Member of Parliament for Surrey Heath and Secretary of State in multiple departments over 15 years, is that right?
Yes.
Sundar Katwala, Director of British Future. And we have Professor Jane Gingrich, Professor of Social Policy at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. So we have an amazing panel to have this conversation with. I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists. We're then going to open out so that you can ask questions as well. So I'm going to kick off with you, Josh. I think I'm right in saying that you coined, or at least started to popularise this phrase called insurgent government with your piece in the FT. I want to start by asking a really basic question. What does it mean to run an insurgent government? And can you give us some examples of what that would look like?
Is that on? Yeah. So Harry just told me he was going to ask me to define this phrase that was not defined in the piece, and I've never actually thought about defining before. So let me just explain a bit about where it comes from. And one thing I think we should do up front is define what we mean by populism. Because I had the misfortune of working for Jeremy Corbyn, ran away to America, did a PhD, but at the start of my PhD, Donald Trump got elected, and so the only thing in discussion at Harvard was populism and what is it. And I basically didn't like the concept and basically distrusted people who used it. And thought that on the whole, it often served as a term that people used to describe a sort of type of politician often that they just didn't like. And that was their problem, not the voters. I think there are some things that are healthy products of populism, such as a distrust of experts. So when I say populist, and when I say, no, but I mean that, it's, and I will say more about it in terms of insurgent government in a second. When I say populist, what I mean is politicians who harness grievances that are in fact legitimate, so there are reasons for those grievances that are real, but they have absolutely no interest, in fact, in addressing those grievances. That's what makes someone a populist. So it's not the academic definition that people often use, which is basically people who are sort of anti-establishment, anti-elite. I don't think that's a helpful way to think about it. So the point of the phrase is it's sort of obviously an oxymoron in a sense. If you're in government, you are the establishment and you run the thing, the state, and yet you have to try and not to be in a certain kind of way. It comes very much from my experience running Labour Together, but also from running, going from that to running a campaign in Makerfield. There are 5 Reform MPs. I think the 6th highest vote share for Reform was in my constituency in Makerfield, bearing in mind that is a seat that has never elected anything other than a Labour MP since 1906. So, everything that Nigel Farage is saying he's going to do is targeted at a seat just like mine. So I think it's roughly 3 things, just to set it out. One is a mindset. And there are a few sort of surprising things for a centre-left government, I think, that characterises that mindset. One is a scepticism of necessity in politics. And I said this in the chamber yesterday. I think that politicians have become a little too quick to say we had to do this because lawyers told us to, or because economists told us to, or because bankers told us to, whoever. I think voters hear that and they tune out. And they think, what is the point in voting for a set of people who then spend their time being told what to do by lawyers, economists, bankers, whoever? And I think in part to be an insurgent government is to say, when somebody tells you that you must do this, must I? Are you sure? Who says? Why? And interrogate the sort of to use a slightly highfalutin academic phrase, the epistemic authority of whatever you're being told. So that's one thing. Another thing is a skepticism of sort of debasing and kind of constraining politics. We so often say, oh, this is not political, this is insert, or so-and-so is trying to play politics with X. That's the point of Parliament and of politicians, is to aggregate and represent interests, and we should talk about politics a little more often like that, in my opinion, because our opponents, who don't actually care about the underlying grievances, all they do is debase politics. So I think there's also part of the mindset which is about sort of, I don't want to sound too lofty about it, but trying to instill some sense of virtue and some sense of character and some sense of, dare I say it, nobility. That probably sounds absurd. It's definitely absurd, having just come from Parliament. But anyway. Second, it's a way of thinking about storytelling in politics. It is an understanding that policy, part of policy is story. And I mean that in a very definitional sense. What is policy? It's to use, or one definition, to use levers of the state to effect some sort of outcome. Whether that works is in part dependent on the story you tell about what you are trying to do and why you are trying to do it. And that, in my opinion, means that reasons really matter for good policy. And you can't separate the sort of technocratic way of thinking about policy from the reasons that you give for a policy, because that's what makes the policy work or not. This is the third and last, I promise, Harry.
Fine.
The third and last is about a way of thinking about the organisation of government. And I think the basic temperament is, it obviously isn't working pretty much everywhere and in all ways, so let's do it differently. And that's a sort of very easy, facile thing to say. And it is also partly a mindset, but it is an application of that to the structures of government. Whether that is the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, whether that is, what mission boards look like in practice. There's lots and lots of things that I'm sure we can talk about in practice that it can apply to, but it's a basic starting point that the way it works now is not working properly for the people it is supposed to serve, and therefore we should and we must, and we have some sort of responsibility in quite a deep way, try relentlessly to do it differently. Yeah. So the last thing I'll just say is that the sort of motivating force behind all of that, I think, is in some ways above partisan politics. It's deeply political, but it's above partisan politics, which is trust in politics and in democracy. And I agree with Parth that sometimes people use trust in politics is really low, therefore we must, and the must just does not follow from the premise at all. But it is so, going from think tank to campaign trail, it's not apathy that I encountered on the doorstep and then produced, almost 1/3 of people in my constituency voting for reform, well, those who voted. It's anger. And it's much more active than we often give it credit for, and often low turnout, I think, at least in my constituency. It wasn't to do with apathy, it was to do with anger. And I think that is just so dangerous, it becomes even more important in a kind of geopolitical world that we live in. And the motivation behind the mindset, the storytelling, and the organisation of government that I think is built into the idea of insurgent government is all about that problem. That's the problem you are trying to solve.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to ask one quick follow-up, which is, you talked a lot about how government works, which is quite a big part of what we're here to talk about. But I'm interested also in what you think an insurgent government what would look different in the world as a result of that, and in particular, whose interests would be represented differently than under a non-insurgent government? Who is it? Whose voice gets heard differently, and what outcomes does that lead to?
So, in my view, the big thing that would shift is that politics would start to be, and politicians would start to think of their job as representatives in a much more kind of aggregative, and this sounds abstract, but it's actually quite concrete, aggregative sense. In other words, my job is not just to represent, I've got lots of emails on the winter fuel allowance, so therefore I will vote against the government. You move beyond that way of thinking about politics. And the net effect of that is that things get bunged up in our state because of vocal minority interests that lock in institutions. I mean, there are forms of this problem everywhere. Planning is one that obviously Michael knows a lot about, but it's a very acute one at the moment. And you would you would almost blow up some of those problems. And you will have to have fights all the time to do it. But the effect should be, at least the theory of the case, is that democracy is a wonderfully majoritarian thing, And the point of having a majoritarian democracy, like the one that we are, in my opinion, very lucky to have, is that you represent the majority of people in a much more effective way. And the bunged up stasis, sort of vested interests getting institutionalized in various ways, serves the exact opposite of the majoritarian interest. So you should have a democracy that represents the interests of the majority of people who live in it.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to come to you next. I think if we take some of those definitions, particularly about the way in which government operates differently, I think there is some examples in your time in office, DFE and Levelling Up, where you demonstrated some elements of that insurgent government attitude. Some people hated it, some people loved it, but certainly if you look at the legacy of the Conservative government, I would point to some of the work that you did in government as examples of where there's definite change that Conservatives can talk about, and that was in part because you took a very different attitude towards governing than I think a lot of politicians would. What does insurgent government mean to you, and how do you think that applies to your experience of Whitehall, the need for that?
Thanks very much, Harry. That's very kind. And I've found myself, you may have seen me, nodding along with everything that Josh said. There wasn't anything he said with which I disagreed. So therefore, I'm sure that there will be people who will think, yes, they are all the same. But I don't want to ruin Josh's career any further. And I'll just develop exactly that point. So the first thing is, I do agree with Josh that populism is a politics of anger, not of answers. I also agree with Josh that populists are picking up on legitimate concerns. And I also think that there needs to be an element of, to use another vogue phrase, or not vogue phrase, wonky phrase, an element of epistemic humility on the part of politicians and those in government. Because, viewed from a particular and a not unreasonable perspective, we've got things terribly wrong in the last 20 or so years. So, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of which I was an enthusiastic supporter, ended up creating problems worse than those that they were supposed to resolve. The financial crash in 2008 was something, as the Queen memorably pointed out, that nobody saw coming, and the consequences of it were not greater economic justice, but greater inequality as a result of quantitative easing and a variety of other policies. And migration, whatever one thinks of it, successive governments had said that they would exercise control over, and yet the numbers have risen to levels that a majority of people in this country, whether reasonably or not, find uncomfortable. So there's a sense of a disconnect between the claims that those who wield power make to the fact that their place is merited on the basis of their cognitive and credentialed superiority, and the lived reality of many people who have seen the changes that have been wrought in the name of globalization or in the name of human rights or in the name of democracy, meaning that they themselves have found that their concerns have been overlooked and their voices have been undervalued. I also agree with Josh that narrative coherence is essential, and in particular, I strongly agree with him about looking at the good in aggregate rather than surrendering to the specific vested interests, which often are vested interests to whom politicians have deferred in the past or to whom we naturally feel close and feel a sort of sympathetic relationship with. So in my own area, when I was Education Secretary, you may think that my policies were disastrous, but I always had in mind the thought that the interests of the overwhelming majority of children should come first, and that the education system was not designed for adults, it was designed for children. And therefore, whether the people who were objecting to my changes were those within trade unions or those who had their own nostalgic view of the importance of bringing back selection because of what it meant for them, we had to put that to one side and concentrate on always thinking, what are those who don't have a voice and those who literally are our future? What is it that would best serve their interests? And the story that I told, or tried to tell, is that we as a country were falling behind our international competitors, and the gap between the educational outcomes of the wealthiest and the poorest was widening. So it was both a matter of the future economic efficiency of our country, but also a matter of social justice, and the belief that each individual was of equal merit that drove my approach. If I can mention a couple of areas where that approach could be exhibited by an incoming government, one of them Jos has mentioned, which is planning. Most of you here will be familiar with the economic work of Mansur Olson, and he made the point that it is often the case in economics that the vested interests of incumbents overwhelm the currently disaggregated interests of future beneficiaries. And nowhere is that more clear than in land use planning. And that is why I think, again, all marginal issues aside, I think that Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennycook have made the right arguments overall. I might quibble about some of the detail, but I think they are absolutely right to do that. And one of the best examples, I think, of insurgent government would be recognizing that while it is those who own property, who exercise disproportionate influence in the planning system, and indeed are more likely to vote, some of those who have been most let down by government over the last 15 and more years are those who aspire to do what any conservative would want them to do, which is to own a home of their own. There's another area I would mention as well, which is the criminal justice system. And here I think it may be more difficult. And I don't mean to make a sort of, petty point, but Keir Starmer has obviously succeeded in and been an exemplary product of the legal system. So he naturally feels a kinship with it and indeed a respect for the rule of law. However, each individual chain in the criminal justice system, the police, the prosecutors, the judges in our courts, the prison system and the probation system requires radical reform. And in each case, you have vested interests, senior police officers, those who manage the CPS, the elites within the Bar Council and the Law Society, judges themselves in the way in which they manage court processes, and of course, the Prison Officers Association and others who have stood in the way of holistic reform. I could say more about what might be required in that area, but ultimately, and it's a point that's reinforced in his latest book by Tony Blair, the first responsibility that citizens require of government is being kept safe. And I think one of the things that is most difficult for them, and I understand why it's happened, is when they see the criminal justice system not working, and in particular, when they saw yesterday people being released early. We can have a debate about to what extent the Conservatives should have addressed this earlier, but I think that this is an area of urgent and necessary reform, and I think that in some cases, having someone who is steeped in the law and respected because of the way in which he holds it in respect enables Labour to go further than we ever did.
Thank you. I'm going to one follow-up from me, Michael, is you made a kind of passing reference to agreement between yourself and Josh, and I think one of the things that unites both of you in what you've just said is this idea that centrism, however we define that, can be radical, I think is a uniting theme there, and that part of that is about challenging the status quo, which we usually expect from the extremes of parties, but actually is coming from the centre ground, however we define that. I wanted to ask you, why do you think, and yet I think a lot of people increasingly fear that centrism, pragmatic politics is unable to deliver for people. That's why people are going to the extremes. How do you think we change that? How do the Conservative Party and the Labour Party need to change in order to be able to answer that challenge?
I think by drawing a distinction between values and institutions. So as a Tory, I tend to be someone who would defer to and seek to protect and to enhance the reputation of the institutions that we inherit. But actually, if your values, and you can be on the centre-left or on the centre-right, are, to go back to the criminal justice system, about keeping people safe, about making sure that justice is not delayed, about making sure that those who are suffering and those who are victims are at the heart of our thinking. And I think most people would say that those were good centrist values. What you should then be is impatient with the way that institutions are currently operating. And that doesn't mean that you object to judicial independence and so on. It doesn't mean that you want to have a move towards an American-style justice system, but it does mean that you can say that these institutions have become complacent and the execution of their responsibilities has become slipshod. And by making those changes, then you can restore confidence. And again, on migration, it was the case in the run-up to and immediately after the 2005 election, when Michael Howard foregrounded the issue, Tony Blair responded in a way that genuinely helped to, at that time, calm people's concerns about the issue. Obviously, it rose in salience later. And he did so by emphasizing the importance of control in order to win back consent for managed migration.
The purpose of IPPR, I think, is often to bring together politicians and then thinkers who take a step back from the day-to-day of politics, and that's why we were really keen to invite both Jane and Sunder here. So I'm going to turn to you, Jane, and ask us to zoom out a little bit, and in particular think about progressive politics. And I mean, it feels like there's, after years of moving kind of rightwards, particularly on economic policy, centre-left parties are readjusting and are putting forward, perhaps starting to put forward a new consensus. And it feels like actually we've been in this since the financial crisis. I think a lot of people thought that would happen quicker, and it hasn't happened. Actually, to be fair, also on the right, you see with Michael Gove, the levelling up agenda, was also, I think, an attempt to respond to that need. So can you say a bit about whether you think that shift is real and what that new consensus might look like and how that contributes to this?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two things, maybe two or three things to say about that to put it in some context. So the first is that the elections of the financial crisis hit left-wing center-left parties particularly hard. And so they'd been losing voters from the 1980s, but that loss had been primarily compositional. So the size of the working class was shrinking. There were fewer people that were really loyal center-left voters. And so there'd been an increase in some kind of electoral volatility. And the policies of the third wave period basically stemmed some of those losses for about a decade, and there was a rebound in some support for the center-left through the late 90s, through the 2000s. But after the financial crisis, the left really began to bleed voters, and these losses were not just compositional. They were actually voters that were defecting and moving in different directions. And those shifts were not uniform across the class spectrum. So what we see is that middle-class voters were really defecting to basically other center-left parties, like Green parties, or like Macron, liberal parties, center-right parties, and so on. But working-class voters were moving into expanded abstention, or in some cases voting for the center-right, or even in some cases populist right, although it's very important to point out that there wasn't this sort of uniform movement to right-wing parties among the working class. So I think from an electoral perspective, the center-left felt the need to sort of rethink what was going on, and in particular rethink the kinds of causes that had left their traditional base of the working class, which is itself a moving target, to expanding from more traditional manual workers to care and private sector low-paid workers. What had left those groups so vulnerable to feeling the kind of anger and demobilization from politics that we've witnessed over the last decade? This combined, I think, with an economic revaluation. So the third way wasn't just on the center-left, wasn't just a rightward shift. It was a move to really think about progressive policies that could occur through the supply side of the economy. So the idea was, if we invest in education, if we liberalize labor markets, but we give people skills to succeed in them, and maybe top up wages through some kind of making work pay type programs in the short run, in the longer run, we'll have a more egalitarian and dynamic labor market that will sort of serve people, and it will have growth and equity-based consequences. The financial crisis kind of blew that open, open as a kind of core economic strategy. So you have these two strands coming together in which there's a sense that we need to do something differently politically to sort of think about the kind of grievances of the people that traditionally voted for us, and we need to do something economically to address concerns that really extend beyond what skills and sort of labor market liberalization alone can promote. So in the face of this, so initially, I think center-left parties were sort of feeling their way around for a way to deal with this. And the sort of first years of the post-financial crisis, they weren't particularly successful. And you see radical parties emerge in some context, like Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece. And you also see, in some cases, a really dramatic decline in electoral support. So the French PS falls below 10%, the Dutch Labour Party falls below 10%, and so on. But there is evidence that there has been a leftward shift since the 2010s on aggregate. So if we look at party manifestos and we look at sort of just aggregate speech in them, left-wing parties in advanced democracy since 2010 have been more left-wing on average than they were in the 1980s. So there's been this movement backwards, and we've seen aspects of that emerge in lots of different contexts. I think politically, though, the challenge, and maybe this is my second set of comments, which I'll hold for a second, but politically, I think we see two things that come out of this. One is that the performance in the 2000s, so the successes in education, the successes in public services, didn't automatically feed back into really stable levels of support for left-wing parties. So the idea that you can just perform well in government and that solves all the problems isn't enough. But equally, talking about left-wing things and having a left-wing narrative without the performance, we're seeing that since the 2010s, and we also don't see much evidence that there's been a really huge rebound in support from the working classes for the political left. So there is this challenge right now that I think center-left parties across advanced democracies are really thinking about, which is how do you build durable coalitions? And this feeds into this, I think, this idea of insurgent government.
My follow-up is basically to ask, I mean, you kind of hinted it there, which is what parties are trying to do is respond to the anger, the frustration, the needs of groups in society who often feel that their politics has abandoned them, has not delivered. And I guess my question is, Josh's comments, Michael's comments, if we buy into the narrative, would enable maybe Whitehall to deliver more, deliver better. But to what extent does that actually follow through to people feeling that, recognizing that, and rewarding parties that deliver on those promises?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing. So what we can learn, like from what I just said, is that just delivering isn't enough, just narrative isn't enough. So what's this sweet spot in the middle? And I think it is something about a feeling of kind of representational credibility, right? So it's about the sense that your interests are represented, and there's a way in which that you can see that as happening over the longer run, and not just in a sort of a narrow short run sense. And where I think I would agree and disagree with the previous speakers is that where people see very little at stake, in a politics that's purely about competence, I think it's hard for people to see in the sort of medium run what's at stake in politics. People need a sense that their group, the people they care about, the people around them, that it matters if the party that represents them wins or loses, right? But if those groups are defined too narrowly, if politics is too sectional, then that also fails, and I think it fails in the sense of allowing parties that have a vision for sort of economic growth and inclusive growth to succeed. And also that you can end up in a politics, and we've seen this in countries that have had persistent low levels of growth for a long time, where they're sort of jockeying about low levels of redistribution and benefits, but there's not a sort of a progressive vision that brings things forward. So the challenge then becomes sort of how you build a kind of broad group-based coalition. And I think if you look at the past successful periods, at least on the center-left where that's occurred, in the UK and elsewhere, there are policies that bring together intergenerational coalitions. And so breaking apart the interests of the old and the young is, I think, a really bad idea for long-run policy longevity, because young people become old, and then it can sort of fragment
saying when to feel payments might not be the answer.
Yeah, exactly. And then secondly, setting up really narrow sectional policies is also potentially, so you want to deliver things to people, but if you are just dealing with the interests of renters or owners, and you're not thinking about the housing market as a whole, then that can start fragmenting interests, and it creates this kind of jockeying that doesn't create broader coalitions. And so what we need to do is think about policies that are create a sense that groups can see their interests represented in them, but that don't define those groups really narrowly. And this is kind of a Goldilocks problem, I think, in terms of policy and politics.
Thank you, Jane. And we're delighted that Jane's joining IPPR as an associate fellow to work with us on this issue. So, Sundar, I'm going to come to you last, but very much not least. I'm aware how little culture, we've talked about very little about the kind of cultural dynamics in this. And obviously when we talk about populism and some of the voting coalition challenges that Jane and the panel have been talking about, that's driving quite a lot of stuff here. So I'd be really interested, what does it take for a government to fight off the populist agenda, and how does culture fit into the story?
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think it's a really good time to have this discussion, start this debate. I think you're asking what's the story of this new government with its landslide, but also maybe what's the story of the society it's trying to govern. And I think, I'm not sure any of us know totally the answers to that. Maybe the government itself, I think it has an agenda, it has some missions, it has some priorities. Does it have a story of the country? Perhaps it doesn't, partly because it's a very dominant and slightly fragile project, perhaps at this early stage, if you think about maybe 1997 or 2010, you know, a very dominant landslide, very clear message of change in terms of who do you wish to remove, maybe slightly a fuzzier message about what that was about, what that's going to be about, an extraordinarily geographic breadth, actually. England, Scotland, Wales have voted the same way, every region, you know, good to have that kind of politics, I think, because you in a way, you've got a government that doesn't have an interest in maybe the cities versus the towns, or versus all, because it's kind of coalition of everyone and everywhere, and yet very narrow in terms of the share of the vote. So I think, you know, developing that story is very important. This is also a discussion so far about change. What happens when people vote for change and don't get it? What does change mean? What does change mean? And it made me reflect, apart from running British Future, it's a think tank and charity which is interested in common ground in polarised times. I wrote a book as well last year and republished it in paperback ahead of the election. And I kind of out myself as an optimist about this country. But why am I an optimist? You could be an optimist by instinct. You might just be an optimistic kind of person. Why not? A bit unfashionable these days. But in my case, I'm an optimist by experience, because I have experienced positive change in my society in my lifetime. But maybe you have to be a little bit older these days to be able to tell that story, because I was born literally 50 years ago now. You know, when my parents came from India and Ireland to this country, met through the NHS, and I was, you know, grew up sort of Irish Catholic with the name Sundercatwala, you know, in Yorkshire, and a Scouser for a bit, and moved to Essex and so on. But I saw positive change because the sort of football culture, Everton were a very good team at this point. But the Everton football introduced me to sort of racism and anti-racism when I was 10 and 15. But actually, I saw positive change in terms of, you know, if you graduated from university in the mid-90s, as I did, I saw some positive change. I mean, I happened to graduate from university, Michael, in a country that never had a black or Asian government minister ever in this country, as did the last Prime Minister, and so on. So there's a sort of, you know, now, if I try to tell this story to sort of people born in this century, they'd be like, Sunder not doing any laps of honour for people not throwing bananas at footballers, or for, you know, the fact that you can have very right-wing Asian and black politicians, very left-wing ones. You know, obviously I'd taken all that for granted. I want a lot more, but I did, you know, there was positive change and it hasn't been experienced again. So that's an important, I think, context for this debate about how change. Now, does my feeling of more possession, more identity, a culture that opened up for people like me, other people will have this experience for different reasons, did someone else have to be dispossessed by that, lose their sense of who they are or not? You'd hope not. But I mean, I'm not giving back the last decades of change, but I'd like to, you know, put the kettle on and work out what we can do this with the, you know, with the in-laws as well, who are at the different end of the political spectrum. You know, how can we, you know, what changes can we make going forward, or how do we build common ground? Now, another reason to be a little bit unfashionably confident or optimistic about Britain, you'd rather have our politics than the politics of America or the politics of France. But to be very specific about what's wrong with the politics of America right now is, if I see you wearing a face mask during the pandemic, I probably know everything about you already. I probably know your views on abortion, on climate change. You might as well have had your ballot papers strapped to your face. So there's stacked identities there where you end up with a politics of no switching, just mobilise your tribe against their tribe, instead of a politics of debate, disagreement, switching, where, you know, somebody's views on culture and identity, someone's views on economics might go together, they might not. And so I think we want to keep that open. I would say a little bit about the riots and the disorders. If you're a bit optimistic about Britain, that was a reason to feel less optimistic about it. What happened, and what do we think about it, and what does it mean for Josh's government and everybody else? You know, scary scenes. Very fast, very rapid. You know, organised racist violence of a kind we haven't seen probably most since possibly 1958, really. But we haven't seen it in this. So for some people who maybe arrived in the first generation, a sort of echo of things they thought had gone away. For other people, something they'd never seen before. Targeting Muslims, asylum seekers, obviously groups that didn't have anything particular to do with the actual tragic killing of Southport. So what do you do about that? Well, obviously, if you're Keir Starmer, if you're the government, you police, you prosecute, you make that visible, you know, that works in the short term. What about the causes of that? What do you do about that? These were quite small events in terms of their scale. You know, I think across 30, 40 places, maybe 4,000 people, 4,000 or 5,000 people involved. The counter-protests, which represented the view of most people, they were relatively, 15,000 people came out and 3/4 of the country were glad that they did. So I think we need a narrative for that 3/4 of society that doesn't agree with that. We need almost a tenth of people who were actually quite sympathetic, said they were supportive of these processes. You need a strategy as to how that's gone on. Saw the Prime Minister talking about this on Sunday morning. He said his strategy was delivering, and he's not wrong, because in terms of whether he gets re-elected for the second half of his decade, grow the economy, sort out the NHS waiting lists, deal with energy bills, fix the potholes, that'll get him elected or not. But what I don't want the centre-left to do, and the socioeconomics and identity debate that you asked me about, I don't want the centre-left to say, you know, you sort out economics and you fix the potholes and community relations look after themselves, because it's a bit different. I mean, if you're suspicious and angry about what's going on in the mosque at the end of the road, because you're not sure, you're fearful of that, it's not because you might damage your van as you drive past. It's about the perceptions of fear, threat, difference, distance from different people in our society. Does a mission of national renewal have a strategy and an agenda to say, how do people feel closer to the other people they share as society? Well, we know it's going quite well with younger people over time if they grew up in diverse classrooms. It's hard to do that 20 miles down the road out on the coast among older people. What's your strategy for common ground in a polarised society? And publishing on that tomorrow as well, so I'll tell you more about that. But I think you need an intentional strategy for the relationships between us, not just a sense that if you deal with the universal economic experiences that actually identity in a changed society looks after itself.
Thank you, Sunder, and I would encourage everyone to read Sunder's book. It's very, very timely. I'm going to now open up to questions. I'm going to do something unprofessional, which is we're going to share a mic, Josh, because they need a mic for the audience.
Oh, sure.
That's fine. Who is taking the mic? This gentleman over here. Thank you very much. So the lady in the front row, just here.
Question for Josh. You said that populism is sometimes when people have concerns that politicians don't want to address. What do you do when people have concerns which politicians want to address, but if they did what the voters asked for, they would get the opposite result? For example, immigration. There are people who want net zero immigration. If you had that, say, tomorrow, you would have a lot more problems than potential solutions.
I'm going to take a couple at the same time. So, gentleman just to your left. Just here.
Hi, thanks very much. Philippe, Centre for Britain Europe. Question for Josh and Michael. You mentioned about sort of blowing up the blockers, and also Michael mentioned about
very good.
Caught up on these quotes. Michael also mentioned about those who don't have a voice, obviously in reference to children, but more broadly, how do you decide in policy and government, that's why I focus on you both, which of the blockers or slowers are right? Especially when you look at a truly majoritarian democracy, sometimes that is also because minorities don't feel like their voices are represented. They don't bother going to vote in some case in other countries because they know it won't change anything. So I just want to sort of ask a bit about that balance without using the phrase "it depends." if I can just ask that challenge. Thank you.
And one more question. I think the gentleman behind. Great.
Yeah, we're going to rack them up here. Can I give a slightly different lens? I think a lens just to say the state is bust. So where does the line get drawn between civil society and the state? And then, Michael, Chatham House rules applies here. So
It doesn't.
on that, okay, it doesn't. In my world,
There
it
are
does.
definitely journalists in the
He's
room.
going to share with us anyway. But if you follow the premise to say the state is bust, It's never going to do what it needs to do based on the need. And I can stop representing even the 16 to 24-year-olds, 870,000 needs, 25% with a mental health issue. That's the next generation productivity. So something needs to change. Give Josh some tips and techniques and share a little bit more with us of what you did in levelling up, because I'll share another lens, my final lens, of what happens in London does not happen anywhere else. You know, I've lived in London for 20 years, but I'm Glaswegian, clearly. Can't hide that accent once you get it. This is a different planet relative to the rest of the country in many measures. So, what's your tips and techniques for actually affecting change? It's not about, in my view, politics or policy. It's about practice. What's going to change? So on your levelling up agenda and then your DFE, because DFE, my goodness, are, you know, heavy, hardcore. How did you change that?
Thank you. I'm going to pass on to the panel. Josh, there was a couple of questions for you there. Do you want to kick off?
Sure, yeah. Why don't I start with the first question? Because it is a fundamental question that the centre-left always gets wrapped up in when it's thinking in this way. If I do what they say, then I'll be bad and racist and all the other things that they think voters think. So first thing to say is that I think if you're doing all of this because you believe trust in politics is broken, then you think that restoring it is a good thing because you think representative democracy is a good thing. So you basically think that voters are reasonable and you basically trust the people of this country. And I do deeply, even in a context in which I fought an election campaign, which time after time, I had all manner of exhausting emotional conversations with voters. So that is the first thing to say, is that I basically think voters are reasonable and in a sense often right. And when they're telling you something that you find uncomfortable and you don't want to hear, it's probably because you are missing something about their world, not because they have a set of deep values that actually you and they disagree with. That tends to be my experience. And that relates to the way that we understand what voters think. This is something that Sundar's often talked about, I think, very effectively, which is we often ask voters weird questions in polling, I think. I'm not interested in my constituents' views on how to reform the Cabinet Office or what to do with the planning system. They're busy. They're doing other stuff. They're a nurse. They're a teacher, and they're very good at that. My job is to figure that out. What I'm interested in, and this goes back to Michael's distinction between the values and the institutions, I don't want to know what the public think about the institutions, really. I want to think about the values. I want to know what they think about the values. And I, more often than not, find there is more agreement in values than people often think. And it is your job to go and figure out how to operationalize that. And I think migration, Sundar's work on migration, for example, is a very good example of that point. But the final thing I would say on this is to go back to the phrase epistemic humility, which I like. My wife is an academic economist. I wrote a book about technology. I've gone fairly deep in the academic world, and the deeper you go, the more you realize that people don't know, really. It doesn't mean there's nothing there in disciplines that you can learn from and grow, but it does mean that to be deferent to, particularly as a politician, you have a mandate. You are elected and you are there to represent people. So to be deferent is dangerous. And whatever area and field of thinking that you look into, macroeconomics, pension funds, investment, there's a whole set of questions about the economy. We basically don't have a model of geographically distributed growth at the moment in economic policy, really, full stop. What more important question is there for the future of the country than that? Similarly on social integration, a huge amount of epistemic humility is required in both scholarship, experts, policy wonks, and so on. So that is the last thing, and it is a very, very hard thing to do because you have to hold on to the idea that the people in your world in Westminster might not actually know what to do. They might have lots of things they can bring to the table and tons of wisdom and so on, but you can meet the best person in the world and they might not know what to do. And therefore, the voter you meet on the street who may not articulate what they think you should do in particularly, in terms that you're used to and straightforward, and you have to dig and you have to listen and it takes time, they might actually see something that you and those people you're talking to can't. And I think that mindset is a very important part of everything that we're talking about.
Michael, there are some questions for you there.
Yes.
Do you want to pick up on this?
Absolutely. So even though it was a question to Josh on migration, the one thing that I would say is that if you want to win an argument for migration, then you've got to make the argument and acknowledge that there may be some weak points in it. So the first thing is that migration in recent years has been running at unprecedentedly high levels. Now, some of that is because of Hong Kong nationals, some of that is because of the Homes for Ukraine scheme, but it's certainly been the case that essentially up until the late 1990s, migration into this country was in the tens of thousands every year. And those were times, as Sundar attests, when we were making progress in terms of community relations and when the economy was more or less doing relatively well. So questions about what the right number is and why we should welcome individuals need to be made in the context of the fact that we're living through an unprecedented time. And again, one of the other things that I would say is people have tried to make the argument for the benefits of migration in Germany recently and have been met with, at best, stony indifference and at worst, active hostility, partly because of two things. One is people associate, they shouldn't, but people associate migration with crime because of the difficulty in deporting criminals, and they also associate migration with extremism because they see that some of the most, how can one put this, some of the most vivid examples of extremism that make them feel uncomfortable and unsafe, they associate with diaspora communities and others. So again, there are anxieties that need to be addressed in order to make sure that you can continue to have both a society that works in multi-ethnic terms and also that people who are going to contribute to the country in lots of beneficial ways have the chance to continue to come. On the point about NEETs and so on and what I would recommend, I think I'll have to practice some basic humility because the situation you describe is one that this government's inherited from me and my lot. So that's the first thing. Secondly, though, I would say it comes back to the point I was just making about making an argument, and the same applies to the blockers who might be right. Gordon Brown governed by speech-making. And that might sound like a bad thing, but in fact it was a good thing because of the way in which he operated. He thought the most important thing to do was not to assert and not to impose by diktat, though he was capable of doing both when required, but to make a sustained argument, to think in ink and then to popularize it and then to see if people could make the case against it. So the speech making, or for that matter, article writing, is critical in making sure that your arguments can be interrogated, that your critics, if they are stronger than you, can be acknowledged and respected. And again, one of the problems that exists at the moment, and now I'm sounding very old-fashioned, is one, memification of politics, TikTokery, and so on, which appeals to mood rather than mind. And then the other related thing is within government, the tyranny of PowerPoint, images and disconnected phrases rather than a sustained argument. I think that one of the great things about our civil service, it's not true in every department, it's not true as much as it should be, is that the culture of the submission, a well-written argument putting forward a set of propositions with which one can take issue, still remains one of the best ways of trying to resolve difficult policy trade-offs.
We're all very disappointed that you're not going to be going on TikTok. Sundar, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a point on immigration. Something very interesting happened with immigration and Brexit, I think, which is that one of the reasons 52% of people vote for Brexit is that governments are perceived to have lost control of the scale and pace of immigration. Michael makes the argument that they should take back control. Something very interesting happens when you take back control of immigration, which is that you now inherit the dilemmas of control and the choices that you made. It was actually quite cathartic for the public we actually saw a significant reduction in people saying, I'm not allowed to talk about it at all. So you'd had a referendum on it, you decided it. But they also felt it got much more complicated because questions like open or closed or free movement or not also became, what's my policy on skills, what's my policy on students, etc. And it turned out that you could unlock quite a lot of consent, actually. Now, the immigration levels went very, very high for exceptional reasons, partly by exceptional circumstances in Hong Kong and Ukraine, partly by policy choices because the government turned out to want students, etc. And the public agreed with those choices, were surprised by the levels they ended up to. Now, we lost that, in a way, pragmatic consent because what also happened was the visibility of uncontrolled asylum sort of lost something that we had, which was the dilemmas of control. So that means that actually in terms of like what do you say to the public? Do you say, I'm right and you're wrong? Do you want to look at the graph? Actually, what most of the public think, some people are very pro, some people are very anti. Most people are balancers. Most people think there are pressures and gains. If you were handling the pressures well, housing, health services, you could keep the gains, NHS workers, care workers. So in a way saying maybe you're right about the pressures, maybe you're right about the gains, but we don't have a system that gives you, partly because the politicians are a bit scared of the public and what they might think, maybe have an excessively hard view. We don't actually have a day like the budget, where the government says, here's the immigration plan, we've decided to keep this, it's quite high, but there are pressures, and here's what we're doing. So actually more voice might get you more consent, and you know the terms on which you're handling it. So immigration attitudes have actually softened quite a lot over the period of time from the middle, and so we could say not if I give you what you want, would I be mad? But actually, what do you really want? People would like to reduce, by the way, the level of net migration will halve in the next 12 months. People notice or not notice. And they'll be very, very concerned if we're cutting care workers when we do that. And so the dilemmas are going to be real. And the public doesn't just have to be the ministers and the politicians who own that. Maybe the public could own that as well.
I think obviously one of the interesting things about the public opinion is if you ask people to do a bottom-up total of how many people they want in the country to go by sector, they will be very permissive. Actually, the numbers will be quite high. When you go to a total level, they want a lower number. So it kind of comes to the challenge of following the public opinion, certainly if you do it in basic terms.
And they think asylum is enormous, and they think all the things they like are smaller. But you've got to have that conversation.
Jane, did you want to come in on any of those questions?
No, maybe just on one thing which Josh said that I want to pick up on, which is that if we're thinking about sort of trade-offs and narratives and sort of how to sort of both listen and be responsive to the public, but to lead them, it's much easier if you have a vision of where you want to go. And I think we're at a moment of some impasse, not in the UK and just in general, but in overall on the center left, in that there is this sort of sense that we need new thinking in terms of the economy. And Josh brought up this point about sort of the lack of a sort of a vision of what a regionally distributed economic model would look like. But there isn't, I think, a singular consensus point on how to either sort of the normative ends of that or the positive ends of that in terms of how to get there. And there's a lot of kind of puzzling through of like, what do we think about the best way to stimulate inclusive growth in this country would look like, right? Is it sort of double down on the things that Britain is good at? Cultural sectors, universities, if I dare say that, has a somewhat vested interest in more funding for the sector. But other things, you know, high-end services and so on that do have this geographic core in the Southeast, or is there a model that looks something like what we're seeing out of Bidenomics in the US, in which you're trying to do industrial policy that would deconcentrate aspects of manufacturing, but the UK economy looks very different than the American economy, and so it's not clear how much that model scales. And so I think we're at a moment where there's a lot of debate about sort of the way to think about an inclusive path to growth. And under those conditions, there's individual policy debates one can have about certain components, and those may be really profound policy debates about immigration, about housing, and so on. But it's harder to lead in a sense of creating a global narrative that if we do these things that might be difficult now, it will pay off in the future without some kind of macro narrative around that. And I think that's something that the center left in general is struggling with.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take another round of questions. The lady just here on the middle row.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were waiting for you.
No, please go.
All right, I'll go for it. Yeah, thanks for that. I think the vision bit is really important, but I think it actually goes much further down. So I wanted to ask a question about, sounds a bit boring, but it isn't, implementation. So I was on the doorsteps as well during the election. The most anger that I both received and felt and heard was in housing estates. And what was really interesting there was, if you look at the Grenfell inquiry, and you don't just focus on cladding, you look at the headlines from that, the implications from that. At this point, Josh, I probably will disagree with you about your point about I'm not really bothered about what they think about institutions, because I think some of the lessons from Grenfell are about, who is being listened to, how do things happen, and who takes responsibility. And I think that point also about what blockers are getting in the way, there's a huge amount to learn from that. And I think we need to start from there as well when we start to think about an insurgent type of government.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more. George, just gentleman over here in the suit.
George Eaton, New Statesman. Thanks to the panel for a fascinating discussion. I just have a question for Michael. The panel's discussed the importance of storytelling. Do you think that the story Labour has been telling has been too gloomy? We know that it's partly influenced by the narrative that the Conservatives had around the public finances in 2010, but that was counterbalanced by different notes on the big society and the sunlit uplands. And then secondly, as a member of a government which consistently protected universal pensioner benefits, what are your thoughts on the means testing of winter fuel payments?
Can rely on the journalist. And gentlemen, just to your right. Yeah, just there.
Hi, I'm Mark Lennon from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for fascinating discussion. There are two things which I was kind of wondering about when you were giving your brilliant presentations at the beginning. One was everyone spoke in favour of aggregation and how we need to kind of think about things in an aggregate sense. But most of the political problems we've seen over the last 20 years, I think, for mainstream parties have come from the blind spots of aggregation. So Brexit, is the sort of classic example, immigration, they're all things which are all brilliant for the aggregate, but where lots of groups of people feel that they were missing out, whether because wages were going down in their sector or there were more house prices were going up or more pressure on doctors and nurses, etc. How do you, a lot of what you're talking about is a crisis of representation where people don't any longer want to be part of some kind of blob, and they're very suspicious of any attempt to aggregate anything. So how do you develop a politics which actually works for an anti-aggregation era which we're kind of in? And then the second question, which is related to that, is that because we're in a kind of period where everything is about relative gains and losses between different groups, is it right to think that you can have these kind of positive sum outcomes? I mean, Sundar was talking about this wonderful story. I was, back in the 90s, I did a lot of work on rebranding Britain and trying to tell optimistic story. In fact, tell a story like Sundar's story about how Britain was changing its identity, moving from a kind of ethnic identity towards a more inclusive type of patriotism, etc. And I think one of the best ways of understanding Brexit and what's happened then is that the people who thought of themselves as the majority, people who were kind of white and Christian and saw themselves as kind of mattering, didn't particularly like the new story about Britain which was emerging. They felt the 2012 Olympics and stuff like that meant that they were becoming foreigners in their own country and didn't have the same purchase or the ability to define who was part of their country. And it's actually a backlash against the secular trend towards inclusion, tolerance, etc., by the people who are not empowered by that. So how do you deal with these sorts of dynamics and the kind of cyclical nature of politics? Because often anyway, those were some of the thoughts I had in your
Thanks, Mark.
very...
It's always had the best questions in. Those are some of the thoughts I had.
Great, so I'm going to come to the panel. Michael, I'm going to come to you first. There was a question directly about the kind of tone of Starmerism so far. Yes. There was a winter fuel payments question. You may also want to comment on Grenfell, given your housing position.
Yes, I'll speak first of all about housing. I think you make a very, very important series of points. It was borne in on me when I was in government that tenants in social housing have felt condescended to and disregarded, and the condition of too much social housing is totally inadequate. Of course, the case of Awabishak after Grenfell provided another tragic reminder of the need to pay attention. There are some factors, like the age of the housing, when it was built, and its natural lifespan, that have meant that the situation has got progressively worse. But it's much more than simply a matter of the quality of the fabric. It's the quality of the relationship that tenants have with the organisations that look after them. And again, one of the things is there's been pressure on housing associations from a variety of different areas to invest money in remediation, to invest money in warmer homes, to invest money, obviously, in navigating the planning system. And so they felt under considerable strain. But it was also the case that, thanks to the campaigning of people like Kweji Twenoboa and Daniel Hewitt of ITV, there was a cross-party consensus in the last couple of years about the need to legislate in order to ensure that social housing tenants had more of a voice. We'll see whether or not that legislation actually leads to the change of behaviour that should be required. On George's question, too gloomy. Yes, I do think that, because I think that, you know, I could quibble about some things the government's done, or I could approve of others, but overall, one of the concerns I would have, were I a Labour MP, and of course I'm not, one of the concerns that I would have is that Keir Starmer's gospel of ordinary hope is more ordinary and less hope. And that I completely understand, both from his character and from what we did, that he thinks that extravagant promises and, you know, some of the rhetoric that he would associate with Boris, some of the execution over the 44 days of Liz Truss would mean that the last thing he wants to do was to indulge in hyperbolic boosterism and catastrophic ideological excess. So I completely understand. But at the same time, I think that, and as we heard from Sundar, there are some remarkable things about which this government can, not boast, that would be the wrong word, but can channel the nature of representation, having a majority in each part of the United Kingdom and so on. And I think that while Starmer is understandably allergic to promises that can't be fulfilled, I do think that there needs to be an extra level of poetry in what he says. I revealed earlier my admiration for Gordon Brown, and I think the one thing about Gordon Brown is nobody could say that he was anything other than absolutely devoted to successful policy implementation, but he was also capable of soaring rhetoric. And you see that in what I think is one of the best speeches ever made by a British politician in the last 25 years, which is the speech he gave during the Scottish referendum in Glasgow. And Keir Starmer can't be Gordon Brown, but recovering some of that. On winter fuel payments, I think the proposal that was put forward by Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, is the right one. Of course, it's sensible to withdraw winter fuel payments from the very rich, but pension credit is an inadequate way of targeting it. It should also be extended, the winter fuel payments, that is, to people in council tax housing bands A to D or A to C.
Thank you. Josh, I'm going to come to you to answer any of them, really, but I think the aggregation question certainly would be worth referring to, and I'm interested in whether you think the government's been a bit gloomy.
Yeah, so many good questions. So I just want to rattle through a couple of very quick things. One is I totally agree with your point. I don't think it's that I'm not interested in what people think about institutions. That was a sort of facile way of getting to a point about migration. Actually, sometimes institutions embody values or fail to. And in those cases, they become the absolute, correct focus of anger, and that's good, and it should be channeled. So I just to be clear about that. I think this aggregative point is a very deep thing in lots of different ways, partly because I am a nerd for algorithms and data, and that whole world is driven by the logic of compartmentalized, statistical inference, essentially. which is the opposite of aggregation. So I think it's a very, very deep question. And I obviously can't answer it now, but a few things that I think we need to sort of revalue and rethink in order to tackle it. Public goods and things that we share, and actually physical spaces, most importantly. One of the problems with this underlying economic policy question that we don't really have good answers to, other than good transport links into cities that grow, is that public spaces, places where citizens congregate, become defiled and rot, literally. And so how are you supposed to get to know your fellow citizen? Where do you see them? Where do you understand their sense of humor? You are on a computer or on the TV, and then you are going to work, and then, you maybe go down the pub if you're lucky to still have one. So where are your public spaces? And I think we need to think in a very deep, systematic way about the sort of policy and economic value we place on public goods and public spaces. It does mean online, but it also does mean physically. We really forget that humans are physical beings, and unless we solve the physical public goods problem, we're never going to crack that. The last thing I would say, just on the winter fuel payments question, I know it wasn't for me, and so it's slightly dangerous for me to talk about it, but I said this in the chamber yesterday. I think it's really important in politics, related to everything we've been talking about, to make principled arguments for things that you do. I think that there is a very good principled argument for, based on the principle of need and the history of winter fuel payments. Gordon Brown brought them in because he was worried about the miserly state pension rise at that point. Pension and poverty had gone up, and there were pensioners who couldn't afford to heat their homes. And what the government has chosen to do is essentially re-anchor winter fuel payments in the principle of need by targeting it. And I think that principled argument, it's just an example of a wider point. It is really important that when there are principled arguments to be made for policies, that we reckon with that principled argument, not at least for the reason that Michael gave, which is that when you have principled arguments meet one another, you're better able to see the flaws in it. But in this case, I think that that is the principled argument. I think it came out interestingly during the debates in the chamber yesterday, but perhaps hadn't come out quite as much before that.
Jane, did you want to come in on any of these
I
questions?
just have one small point, just on housing. I think that people learn how to be citizens from the moment they're born, and that the way the state treats them feeds into that in a lot of ways. And there have been some areas that have really improved over time. Like, I think schools, the way kids are treated in schools, working class and kids from different backgrounds, is probably much better than it was in the past. They're treated with more dignity and respect and belief that they can succeed. And I think there's other parts of the state where people are treated much worse than they were in the past. And probably the disability system is one of those areas where there's been a much more sort of punitive turn in a lot of those things. And housing is another. And so it's about, I think it's about, no matter kind of what our principles are about kind of institutions in a distributive sense, it is about thinking about how we create institutions that treat people fairly and that respect people as citizens, and also make them feel like valued members of society. And that might not create any votes for particular parties or be a narrow delivery goal, but it's one that I think is extremely important. And there is evidence in the academic literature that the way people are treated by the state helps all sorts of things, like whether they're likely to turn out and vote, whether they feel valued, and so on. So it's a kind of a broader discussion that I think cuts across a lot of these about sort of how our institutions treat people and what are the values we would want that to embody.
And Sunda, did you want to comment on anything?
Yeah, but Mark Leonard asked a very interesting, I think, philosophical question about aggregation. I think that's really important because democratic politics is collective choices. And actually, in a very atomized, individualistic society, people forget that. And that's why I place quite a lot of emphasis on shared identities, shared moments, things you ask people to think collectively where none of us get everything we want. But I want to quibble a little bit of the detail as well about the story. So Remain lost that 2016 referendum, partly because they won the argument when they were talking broadsheet to graduates. And basically about 3/4 of graduates were kind of on side, but it was a sort of all-graduate coalition of messengers that said, isn't it going well? But they couldn't persuade the people who hadn't gone to university that it wasn't going. So there was, in a way, a social segregation. Lots of people who voted Remain who didn't really know anybody who'd voted Leave, and the other way round, and so on. And so you want to sort of bridge those divides. What was slightly unsuccessful about the sort of New Labour idea about identity, which you were involved with, I was involved with a bit, it's pitched at people like me, is that it was unsuccessful because it actually had a story which was like the future, not the past. If you want to be in the future, let's tell Japan and the rest of the world, let's tell them we're not traditional old boring Britain anymore. We're new and fizzy and modern and millennial and so on. And like, Britain's a young country. You're like, no, it's not. What's that about? Because the Britain I want to be included in is a product of Britain's history. It arises, and what Danny Boyle does much more successfully, I think, is show you the arc of the change. It writes complicated history of a little island that accidentally goes around the world, conquering it all, giving it back, having immigration and diversity. But that's our story. That's why we are who we are. And if we can't do it, we can't do that. So it's the future because of the past. That's a more bridging story. It's what you do with sort of like a monarchy in a very diverse society. You use these bridging institutions to bridge more, to actually create the shared experiences that people want. So I don't think that was about, please give me 1972 back. I think it was more about we'll make a different choice now, an existential choice for some people, a more pragmatic choice for other people. So I think what's happened now, which is interesting, is that there's a populist minority which imagines itself to be a majority when it isn't. So the 14% of people who voted for Nigel Farage, they have very distinctive views. They're much more distinctive, actually, than the Liberal Democrats or the Green voters, but they think everyone agrees with them because everyone they speak to knows that. So actually, legitimate concerns is about your right to a voice in a parliament in which other people disagree with you. It's not your right to get everything you want. So I think maybe getting back to that debate about aggregation might be part of the answer.
Fantastic. So I'm going to bring us to a close. It's been a really fascinating debate, and I'm sure everyone agrees. I think one of the really salient points that comes out to me is it feels like we're in this moment where the old system is broken, but we really don't have all of the answers yet about what this new politics and this new policy consensus will look like. And at IPPR, I think the programme that Parth is talking about, that this is part of, is setting out to try and come up with the answers. And so we'd love to go on that journey with everyone in the room and certainly with the people on the panel. So can I ask everyone to give a round of applause to our amazing panel? Josh is in trouble with the whips, so he's off. There are a certain number of free drinks, and then we run out, and the bar will start charging you. So you've now got a choice about whether you come to the front and try and speak to Michael, or you go and get a glass of wine. But thank you, everyone, and do stick around for some drinks.